Hello, everyone. We are lucky to have Alec Stapp with us today. Alex is the co-founder and co-CEO of the Institute for Progress, and he will be hosted by Ethan Jiang, who is a fourth-year BA MA student at the University of Chicago, where he studies economics and international relations. I'll turn it over to Ethan, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. Really grateful for the chance to sit down with Alec. Yeah, for starters, so I know that before you were at IFP, you were doing other things in tech policy at Niskanen, at Mercatus. And so I wonder kind of what the origin story for IFP is coming out of those things. It seems like some of the things that I are pretty squarely within tech policy, so biosecurity, AI, but there are other parts of this research agenda that I would say fall out of the tech policy realm. So housing comes to mind as one of those areas. So I guess what brought you and Caleb to this project?
Yeah, great questions, and thanks for having me for the conversation. So I think, yeah, some things are more squarely within traditional tech policy, and I would even think it would describe what counts as traditional tech policy in DC terms, of what gets funded and what gets worked on. It's traditional issues are things like antitrust, privacy, Section 230, which deals with content moderation on social media platforms, net neutrality when it comes to the broadband internet, FCC regulation debate. Those are issues that people have been debating for, at this point, more than a decade and a couple decades in some cases. And so those are like really, really well-trodden policy issues to be working on, which is interesting because there's lots of people working on them. You can get into fascinating intellectual debates with people, but there's really not much progress being made on those topics. Literally, when it comes to net neutrality, like we repeal it, we impose it again, we repeal it again. Nothing really seems to change in terms of outcomes. And we also don't think they're the most important issues. And so privacy matters, but does it matter more than like getting millions of high-skilled immigrants into the United States? Does it matter more than your government spends $50 billion a year at NIH and SF on basic science funding? Getting that right really matters, I think. And it's like a hugely important issue. And they're much more neglected. So how NIH and NSF spend that money is not really the subject for like much think tank discourse or research, very little advocacy work. There's tons of lobbying on the total top line revenue numbers. The university lobbies are very strong in terms of trying to influence Congress to spend more money. And then there are some small government, low tax groups that are advocating for cutting those budgets, but very, very few groups working on actually influencing how those dollars are spent. Are they being spent on high risk, high reward research? And so when Caleb and I were starting IFP, we really just looked at the entire innovation policy landscape, and we thought, what are the most important, neglected, and potentially tractable areas to be working on? And that brought us to things like meta science, high integration, biotech. And then since you mentioned housing, I would say, yeah, housing is definitely not traditionally or at all a tech policy issue. At the state and local level, it's mostly a zoning issue. But I think we actually think there are it works as a federal tech policy issue because, and we have our plan for housing policy in the future is to focus on materials sciences, like public funding for R&D to, invent better, cheaper, stronger building materials, automated building systems. You can think of things like automated building code checkers to see if your blueprints and your building plan is in compliance with local zoning codes. You can use technology to try to automate the compliance process across our very heterogeneous zoning system in the United States and building code system. So there are lots of I think there are interesting neglected federal levers that apply a technology lens to housing, even though the vast majority of housing policy in the US is state and local and it's zoning. And I wouldn't even say the technology stuff is more important, just that it's somewhat neglected.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And since you mentioned, I guess, the intersection of technology and housing, I know Arpit Gupta has a recent working paper where he talks about using LLMs to process lots of local zoning regulations. It seems like a really promising area to be working on. So I promise we will have time to chat about all these things in detail. But to keep it broad for starters, IFP is pretty young. It's only been around for a couple of years, but I'd like to know what you think the big wins are so far, what gives you, I guess, motivation that this is something with legs and something that can keep making impact in the future.
Yeah, so I think early on, we've had some good milestones in terms of just like growing the team, establishing ourselves in Washington, D.C. Our long run goal is always counterfactual policy impact. It's in the areas we work on, are we actually influencing Congress or rulemaking or other decisions within the executive branch? And are our efforts actually changing outcomes? Of course, it's a very hard thing to measure. We're not doing randomized controlled trials here, but you can develop like case studies and plausible arguments for why you can show that like your work actually had an impact, especially if you're doing things behind the scenes, which I think that's one underrated thing about IFP that people don't quite realize for a natural reason, which is they see all of our work in public, they see stuff on social media, they see our newsletter on our website, but by definition, they don't see the work we do behind the scenes, and often we can't talk about it too much because part of working with policymakers is that you let them take the wins and you're there to support them and help them and really enable your champions to get the policy. And so probably 60% of what we do on a daily basis is totally behind the scenes and almost no one will ever hear about it. And that being said, most of what we've been doing for the first 2 to 3 years has been foundation laying and establishing ourselves in the policy discourse in DC, really making our name for ourselves on certain key issues like permitting reform. I think we've been the single most effective voice in that debate. And then doing things like building trust with federal policymakers. And maybe just to be clear, I'm not sure how your audience knows this, but we exclusively do federal policy, no state and local, no international policy. So it's really about building relationships with people in Congress and in the executive branch. And a big milestone for us was getting a partnership with the National Science Foundation, where we entered into transactions agreement, just like a creative type of contract, a $0 contract with NSF, where now our staff, some of the people on our staff have NSF laptops, badges, they have access to lots of internal NSF data that's not public, help analyze and run experiments, simulations of different types of scientific grant making that NSF is doing, and kind of advise them on potentially other ways they funding science. And so it's a point where NSF trusts to enter into this kind of novel agreement with an outside organization. And so the results of those experiments are still in progress, but
yeah,
we're excited
that's a huge win in my book. Since you mentioned, I guess, I'd like to ask a little bit about why the scope is defined in the way it is. So to my knowledge, IFP is pretty squarely focused on American interests. That seems pretty reasonable in a place like DC, where most people are focused on American interests. And I think in the kind of original, I don't know if manifesto is the right word, but you write a little bit about how it's good that, technological progress happens in a liberal democracy that's open to immigration like the US. Yeah, that all checks out to me. Still, I think that there are a couple edge cases where things might be good for the US, but perhaps on net bad for the world. I think about, developing compute exclusively in the US as an example of that, right? Where maybe we secure our supply chain instead of putting it in Saudi Arabia or China, but we might also spark some arms race concerns. So I wonder on those edge cases, how you think about balancing American interests versus global security or interests.
Yeah, I think for one, it's part of it is a focus of a small team. And so, there are great folks doing work on developing countries and policy abroad. We're currently 18 roughly full-time people, most of whom are based in DC. And so part of it is to focus our team and just say, hey, let's just focus on American interests in Washington, DC at the federal level. And of course, then to be as effective as possible, you want to frame things in American interests. And we ourselves are Americans. And so I think that this is the best place for us to have an impact in the debate. And then in terms of trade-offs, I think it's really context specific on each individual issue. Because you mentioned AI compute, I think if you've seen our Compute in America series where we're advocating for building AI data centers here in the United States to do, frontier training runs, part of this is with the eye towards what is the private market not going to do necessarily on its own. We think investments in security are not naturally going to happen because, of course, the frontier labs like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, they don't want their model weights to be stolen, but They don't have, one, the resources or the necessarily sophistication that like, NSA, CIA level security has. And two, they'll try as much as they can to prevent them from being stolen, but their downside is capped at their private losses. If they're stolen, that has spillovers on the world that they're not internalizing. And so there is a public, social interest in making sure that those data centers are secure. And yeah, and then it's just a firm belief that there is somewhat of an inevitability that we're going to build advanced AI, and that it's much better to be built in the United States than in some of these competitor nations.
Yeah, glad people are paying attention to the cyber element in particular. Seems super important. Yeah, so one last question about IFP broadly, and then we can dive into some specific issues. So recently, IFP was the subject of what I think I can fairly call a hit piece from the Revolving Door project. There's also, I guess, recently some controversy over Matt Iglesias's appearance at a fracking conference. You're often in conflict with the Sierra Club over energy permitting. So I guess broadly, it seems like at least sometimes there's some tension between the policy you're advocating and the traditional American left. I wonder what the theory of change is here. So I can imagine there being two forks in this road. One where you try to sit down with groups on the left and change their objectives, and then another where you try to convince policymakers that these groups on the left are just flat out wrong. I think both of those have drawbacks, and the second one, at least to me, seems somewhat difficult given that these groups on the left have, I think, significant rhetorical sway with policymakers, if not evidence-based policymaking sway. Yeah, so I guess broadly, how do you envision IFP dealing with these interests on the left that are somewhat opposed to IFP's agenda?
I'm sorry, I think I got most of that question. Maybe I don't know if it's my internet's unstable or yours, but I got most of that question, so I can definitely answer it, and let me know if my internet is unstable from here, if you can hear me. But yeah, so on the how we think about our relationship with the left, I think in general, so one, the most important thing is the substance of the matter. And so the protest is pretty funny because if any reasonable person reads Matt Iglesias's analysis of the global and local effects of fracking, for example, I think he's just right on the merits across the board. So unless you have like some really specific ideological commitment to not doing fracking in the United States, if you have any kind of commitment to emissions, to climate change, to national security, energy abundance, like all of those point towards some types of fracking being net positive. And also kind of a realist approach, and this is related to the Manchin-Barrasso permitting reform bill that we support and a lot of groups on the left don't support, which is kind of an idealism on the left that it's understandable, and I think it's generally well-intentioned, but it does not grapple with the political realities of Washington, D.C., and is not super concerned with actual practical impacts. And so, again, for example, permitting reform, it's requires 60 votes in the Senate. No party currently has 60 votes. No party in the foreseeable future will get anywhere close to 60 votes for permitting reform. And so it is, by definition, budgetary matter. It cannot go through the reconciliation process that only requires a simple majority. It has to be bipartisan. It has to get 60 votes in the Senate. And at that point in time, now you need to think of there are different types of balances you could strike. A bill could be slightly more Democratic, slightly more Republican in terms of what people get. But at the end of the day, you have to have a bipartisan bill that can get significant support from both sides of the aisle. And so then it's about balancing interests. And I think the Manchin-Barrasso bill is great because from the most rigorous climate modelers, it shows a 10-to-1 net emissions reduction. And so yes, it streamlines some oil and gas leasing, but it does far more to accelerate the build out of clean energy and actually reduce our emissions on net, in addition to producing more energy overall, improving America's energy security position, and accelerating the transition to clean energy. And so I think it's a pretty big win. It's not a perfect deal. No deal is perfect, but this is about actually grappling with legislation that's moving through Congress, that's viable in Congress, and just understanding how the system works. There is no reasonable near-term future where the left wing of the Democratic Party gets to write a permitting reform bill that is only carve-outs for solar or something. That just is not going to happen, and you have to be realistic about that.
Yeah, totally fair. And I think this is a good segue into a few questions about energy, which has been a big focus for IFP, and which I think is vitally important. And maybe the permitting reform bill is a good place to start here. Just to give some context for our audience, the permitting reform bill largely focuses on the National Environmental Protection Act, which sets standards for how energy projects can be built in the United States. So two big areas of focus are energy transmission, which has been kind of a regular pain point for clean energy, and then energy generation projects themselves. So just to throw out a data point here, in the offshore wind sector specifically, there's 20 times as many projects held up in permitting as currently in operation. So seems like there's a lot that can be done here and a lot of power that we might unlock through permitting reform. I guess the difficulty here is that this bipartisanship that you're talking about seems a little time limited. Manchin is retiring at the end of this year, so if it doesn't pass now, it seems kind of difficult to get something in the future. With that in mind, what do you think are the prospects for the Manchin-Barrasso bill? And if Manchin leaves, what do you think are the prospects after Manchin in a world where I guess you don't have this kind of keystone Democratic senator to drive progress?
Yeah. I would just slightly adjust the framing of the bill. It actually, given all the focus in the public discourse on NEPA, it's actually not that much of a NEPA oriented bill. So the transmission reforms that are included there, it's mostly about backstop authority at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Currently, citing interstate transmission lines involves getting permits from multiple states and jurisdictions, and any one particular locality can hold up or veto a project from being built. And so this is not at all how pipelines work. Pipelines are cited and permitted by the federal regulators at FERC. And so it's really just trying to put them closer to equal footing for transmission lines. And so the bill has a 12-month backstop authority where if the states after a year don't grant a permit to a project, the federal government can step in if they so choose. And then on the oil and gas side, it's not really about NEPA. It's more about mandatory leasing, because Republicans perceive Democratic administrations as dragging their feet and just almost refusing in what they would view as an unlawful way to grant oil and gas permits for drilling. And so that's just like a mandatory, like you must grant this number of leases per year. But there is some small board NEPA stuff, like we're shortening the statute of limitations to file a NEPA lawsuit from 6 years to 6 months, which would be great. Wouldn't solve all the issues we have with NEPA, but would be a good reform. Tractability, like how is this looking? I think it's highly contingent on the presidential election. In a Kamala Harris win, the best outcome for the bill is a Kamala Harris win in a Republican Senate, and the House could go either way, because then the partisan balance is still very good. It's like we have divided government again. This is a bipartisan bill. And Kamala can, if I think she does, like, she's called for permitting reform explicitly in her presidential platform and her policy platform. She has not weighed in on this particular bill. And so insofar as it will anger some people in her coalition on her left flank, she could just, give the nod and the wink to say, get it done in the lame duck. It can be a Biden thing. And then she gets to benefit from the actual impact and effects of this in 4 years when she runs for re-election. The inverse is not really true. If Trump wins, especially if he gets a Republican trifecta, which would be likely under a Trump win, then I think the partisan balance of the bill falls apart, because you don't need Congress to require the president to do oil and gas leases if it's a Republican. And so Trump will just, of his own volition, grant those. And I think they go back to the drawing board and they say, what can we do with a Republican trifecta to do permitting reform? And again, they don't have 60 votes in the Senate. I don't believe they would repeal the filibuster for this. They might try to get creative, but I think they would just say, like, let's do our own, let's take a step back and not actually pass it. And so those things net out to, I think, roughly a 40% chance that it gets done in the lame duck. And it's much better than 50% if Kamala wins and there's a Republican Senate, and it's much lower if Trump wins, just given the bargaining dynamics.
Yeah, walking through the Punnett squares there is helpful.
Yeah.
I guess another topic within energy that has been quite salient in the election is protectionism. So for all kinds of high-tech industries, EVs, battery storage, solar. The Biden administration has kind of embraced what were originally Trump era tariffs on these technologies, which has potentially deleterious effects for trade on energy. And I guess batteries and solar are kind of big players in the clean transition. Potentially having access to cheap technology from China seems pretty important here, but there are also national security arguments on the other side. So you've written recently that you're increasingly unconvinced by these national security arguments. I wonder if you can walk us through how you're thinking about this issue and the trade-offs there.
Yeah, for sure. So I think I'm in general, I start from a baseline skepticism of tariffs. I'm basically with the economic consensus that free trade is good. Global supply chains are good and lead to better outcomes for the United States and the rest of the world. But I'm also not an absolutist about it. I think there are narrow cases such as national security concerns, being overly reliant for critical inputs, where you do want to have some kind of trade policy or at least subsidization to ensure some kind of domestic capacity, especially in the potential for military conflict. And so, I mean, I'm a realist in the sense that China is clearly in an adversarial position with the United States currently, and there is I think, small but non-zero chance that emerges and becomes a hot war at some point. And so you have to make sure you position yourself to be able to produce necessary materials for the case of a conflict with a near peer like China. And so I'm open to the idea of let's do national security tariffs, but then I look at the specifics of certain materials. And so again, I would contrast this with like the chip stuff from the Chips and Science Act, onshoring, cutting edge semiconductors. Chips are an essential component of lots of military equipment, essential component for lots of a large share of our economy. And so generally supportive of those measures. But then when they start doing them on batteries and EVs, and the argument is not even so much national security, but just that this is, the industries of the future and we can't fall behind. They start to not be too convincing to me. And the main thing I think about is when are you reliant on an ongoing flow versus you can do stockpiling? So I contrast this in my mind with Europe being dependent on Russia with the Nord Stream pipeline, right? So like if Russia either tries to cut off natural gas to Europe or it gets blown up or something, you can burn through any remaining natural gas you have very, very quickly. And then the natural gas generators don't work anymore. And now you don't have power, right? And you need to either cut consumption a lot or find other sources very quickly. Solar panels don't work that way. They have, on average, 30 years of useful life. These are durable assets. If China wants to sell them to us below cost or just very cheaply, and they're the best at producing them, I think we can just stockpile lots of them. We can take advantage of them. And then in the event of a conflict, if they were to cut us off full stop, we have the solar panels. They don't, in terms of like the ones they've shipped us. They're not remote accessible. They don't even have any moving parts. This is not telecommunications infrastructure. I'm concerned. I've been supportive of forcing divestiture of TikTok for a long time because that's, I believe, a sensitive sector. I'm supportive of moves to restrict Huawei's access to our infrastructure system as well, because there is a plausible story of remote access or nefarious sabotage there, where like I just don't see the case with solar panels or EVs in particular. And if China is just like better at producing them, these are not also like the highest paying jobs. There are much higher paying jobs in the economy on average than some of these industries. And then the last point here is that Noah Smith almost persuaded me that batteries were an exception because it's obvious that drone warfare is the future of modern warfare. And so you want the batteries, and like a drone is just, a device that can fly as a battery. And so you make sure you have battery capacity. But then I saw Austin Vernon point out on Twitter when we were having this conversation that Tesla's Gigafactory has the ability to produce like on the order of, I think, tens of millions of drones. Yes, it's a flying battery, but it's a very small battery relative to a car battery. And so you don't need an entire domestic supply chain that could outfit building millions of electric vehicles per year. You just need enough to supply millions of drones if you think the future of warfare is drone warfare. And so I'm still pretty skeptical. And I think it's about this like ongoing flows versus stocks situation.
That makes sense. I'm with you on solar and batteries, but with EV specifically, I think there's some concern over Chinese car software that might give them access to data in the same way that I guess the concern over TikTok is that there's access to data. What do you make of
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, that seems like somewhat persuasive to me. And then my general philosophy on all sorts of things is if there's a compelling case, do a targeted intervention. So I think what you just said is reasonable. I've seen similar concerns, especially as we move to self-driving vehicles. Could they remote access them and create all sorts of chaos? And so could there be a targeted intervention where we have limitations on the software in these vehicles, or they need to be like red teamed before being deployed? I would want to go deep with experts on that. And if they told me that's not really plausible, they could hide things and you really just need to have American made vehicles, I would be open to that argument. But if someone told me, yes, you could reliably inspect the vehicles or mandate American made software or something, then that could be a targeted intervention I'd support.
Yeah, makes sense. I'll say, I think at least in their current iteration, I am at least a little skeptical that the justification for EV tariffs is national security concerns, and it is maybe more politically sensitive constituencies in Michigan. But
many such cases, yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll see where this goes. Yeah, I want to pick up on what you said about critical minerals or critical supplies in general. So this week, exciting news in Arkansas, up to 19 million tons of lithium potentially, in what seems to be, I guess you are a big fan of this little cycle where we have farmers stumbling upon the mother lode of cobalt or gallium or lithium in their backyards. So yeah, I guess I'm interested both in general reactions to this kind of cycle and also if you think there's anything we might do to kind of systemize this kind of discovery. So the USGS put out a report where they talked about using kind of novel ML methods to locate critical minerals, which seems like a really promising development to me. And I guess I'm interested in your take on whether that can be replicated in the future.
Yeah. So I think a couple caveats here. One, we haven't done any work on critical minerals thus far, so these are mostly just tweets at this point. I mostly find the meme funny. To get a little more serious on the substance from what little I know on this topic, I would say one, I think we're still very far behind in terms of processing capacity. So China's real choke point seems to be not necessarily on access to the raw materials, but actually to the processing and refinement capacity. And they have like near monopoly in a lot of different areas for processing. And it's tough to compete with because it's such low value add. So it's hard for any other country to profitably invest in this sector or to want to outcompete China because there's no actual money to be made in terms of private market incentives. And so, yeah, definitely open. I think the thing you mentioned about government data, I think this is where there's often a public good of, better mapping, better resource planning that allows the private sector to then go do exploration themselves or actually exploit a resource that we need more processing of in the United States. And then, yeah, I would be open to specific plans and industrial policy towards how do we actually reshore some refining capacity and processing capacity for critical minerals, because we clearly do have some natural resources. And the last point I would make here is like that meme is funny because it's the classic, like, it's a very it's obvious to economists, right? The cure for high prices is high prices. A lot of these minerals are only rare or critical because we haven't looked very hard for them. This is very analogous to the peak oil arguments in the mid to late 20th century, where people thought we were hitting near peak oil, and then price of oil goes up, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, we find more oil in places because like now you have a strong incentive to go look for it. And so I think that's similarly what we're having here, where lithium prices spiked for 2 years post-COVID. Now they've come back down a lot, but in the meantime, people went looking and they found a lot of it. And so, yeah, I think people who aren't economists often underrate supply elasticity and substitution effects. And so they see one input become very expensive and they think, this whole technology is going to fail now, or they panic about what we're going to do. And I think it's hard to respond to them because as an economist, you can't say, no, here's exactly the solution we're going to do, because if you knew that solution, we'd already fixed it, right? But there is an understanding of the fundamental incentives at play, and you can trust that somewhere either we will substitute an expensive input for a less expensive input, or we will actually find more raw materials where we didn't know they were.
Yeah, I think trust the market is a pretty tried and true strategy. And one good example of trusting the market is the ongoing partnership between nuclear companies and AI data centers, something that you've touched a little on, and that's I think partly an area of focus for the emerging tech team at IFP. So again, just to lay a little groundwork, seems like we're going to need a lot more energy for AI data centers. A Goldman Sachs report recently estimated a 160% increase in data center power demand by 2030, driven by AI. And I think there have been kind of a variety of responses to this. So Sam Altman's been investing in fusion for a while, but there are also, I think, more traditional approaches, things like retrofitting 3 Mile Island to get it back online, or investing in small modular nuclear. And then I guess there are other like non-nuclear approaches as well, like maybe let's just things like that. So I guess maybe the answer is just it's a mix of these things, but I wonder if you're particularly optimistic about any particular energy technology in kind of meeting this demand, or I guess if we trust the markets, what do we think the markets are going to do here?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, one, in general, I'm like an all of the above person, and I think policymakers in general should try to set performance standards or set outcomes, but let the market decide how to reach them. This is very almost boring to say, right? Like ideal climate policy here would be like set a carbon tax, and then let the market invest in types of energy sources that make the most sense for AI data centers. Obviously, we don't have a carbon tax, and so we're in a weird situation where the big tech companies have made very public and very loud commitments towards net zero emissions, and now this is like somewhat cheap talk in the ChatGPT era, where they thought that they had like normal data center loads that they could easily meet with clean energy. And now that they're looking at orders of magnitude more compute demand, they're realizing they need to like get creative with solutions. They're not yet ready to abandon their net zero emissions commitments. And so they themselves are the ones who've had to get really creative with, bringing old nuclear back online that we never should have decommissioned, or entering into contract agreements for small modular reactors. I'm most bullish on solar and storage. I think that if you just look at the exponential cost decreases in both solar and battery storage, this is likely going to be one of the cheapest options. And again, not that I'm opposed to any, like, great, they're doing the nuclear deals, but I think the trends are hard to beat there. And I would say, I think we'll solve the daily intermittency problem pretty soon in terms of just like building enough storage. Seasonality is a bit tougher, and so obviously there can be entire weeks where it's cloudy and you want to be able to run your data, because energy is such a small percentage of AI data center cost. It's around 5% of total cost. They're mostly maximizing for amortizing the capex for the GPUs, so they want to run them 24/7. And if you could do things like have diesel or gas backup generators for those like parts of the season where you really run out of backup storage, but that comes into conflict with some of their net zero emissions commitments. And so I think definitely I want to see much more investment and demonstration projects around carbon capture and sequestration, to the point where it's a credible commitment that if you build a natural gas plant, you can put carbon capture and sequestration on it to get close to net zero emissions from natural gas. But from our early exploration there, it's an early stage technology that we can't really fully bet on now. And so, long story short, all of the above, most bullish on solar and storage, but also recognizing it's not a perfect technology, and we'll need other options as well.
Yeah, that all checks out. I guess just to push you a little further, even beyond CCS. So there's been a lot of talk at UChicago specifically about geoengineering. We have a new climate systems engineering initiative that started up here, $100 million in funding. I've been to some of the seminars. Seems like David Keith, who's kind of the guy in charge, is thinking pretty seriously about this. Some other scholars are too. And the technology that's at the center of this, which is sulfur aerosol injection, is already in very small ways in the private sector. There's the startup called Make Sunsets, which got a New York Times feature. I wonder if you've thought at all about geoengineering as a potential climate solution, and how you or people at IFP are thinking about the technology.
Yeah, we're pretty open-minded about it. We haven't done any work on geoengineering yet, but it's definitely could fall within our wheelhouse. It's an technological solution to a major social challenge, and in the case of climate change, a global challenge. And so it's definitely something that we are going to keep looking at, and we're open to researching, supporting, advocating for. Our general position on geoengineering is that the public discourse is a bit behind on this, I would say. It's that there's this idea of like this is like tech bros, tech billionaires in Silicon Valley want to control the weather and do this on their own. And it's like we just learned that sulfur dioxide emissions from international shipping, international ships, container ships, had been having somewhat of a cooling effect on the environment for decades. And we just introduced new regulations around sulfur dioxide emissions to reduce those. And now we're seeing the hottest year on record. That's not, of course, not to say those emissions themselves were per se good, because they actually did have negative side effects because they didn't go high enough in the atmosphere. But they were having some unintended positive benefits in terms of warming, at least. And so the point of that is we've been doing unintentional, kind of dumb, inefficient geoengineering already. And so a smart approach to geoengineering would be careful and incremental, but it also would be planned out of, what's the best way to do sulfur dioxide? Well, let's go to the stratosphere. Yeah, I just think it's worth experimenting with, and if we're able to do it in a controlled manner, it could solve a lot of problems. 100%. Again, it's part of like an all of the above approach.
Yeah. Checks out. I think what David Keith has said about this is that there are some bad faith actors who are looking for a moratorium not just on use of geoengineering, on geoengineering, which seems to me like a really short-sighted
Yes.
approach, because I think the value of the information is pretty high. Even if that information is negative and we realize that there are lots of negative consequences, maybe there's like I don't know, like pretty quick warming after you stop geoengineering, that's still something that I think is valuable to know.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not persuaded by many, like, you see these moral hazard arguments a lot. You see this is the case against carbon removal or carbon capture, is it will, in some sense, allow us to keep burning fossil fuels longer than we otherwise might. Yeah, and the moral hazard of geoengineering, I think it wouldn't have its intended effect, I don't think. I think we live in mostly democratic countries that are responsive to the demands of voters, and voters like high standards of living. They like consuming energy because it makes their lives better. And just because you ban research into geoengineering doesn't mean people won't burn fossil fuels. It just means that if we end up in the worst case scenarios that the IPCC report contemplates, we won't be prepared to have proper response to that. And so it's kind of like bang shot argument of we're going to cut off all alternatives, force the global population into a corner to where they voluntarily reduce their standards of living by reducing energy consumption. I think is just very unrealistic.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I want to shift gears a little and talk about biosecurity. And I guess first is just a framing question here. It seems to me that COVID is pretty far out of the popular memory. People just aren't thinking about biosecurity seriously in policy circles. And as a secondary problem, the people who are thinking about biosecurity seriously are often, I think, thinking about it retroactively, maybe with some vengeance in mind or some conspiracy theory in mind. So I guess as kind of a broad challenge, how do you think about shaping popular opinion around biosecurity so that people care about it and care about it in the right ways?
Yeah, it's very tough. And honestly, we are not a grassroots organization. And so I think I don't often think about how we can shape public opinion. Um, it is relevant to think about public opinion when when our team is communicating with policymakers. And so if you have public opinion on your side, you can definitely signal that to them in various ways. You can give them polling data. You can give them data on what people who live in their district or state believe and want them to do. So it can support arguments that you already want to advance. But part of this is just a tractability. It's a tractability issue where, again, we're a team of 18 people. I don't have any pretense that I will be able to shape what the American public believes on any particular topic. What I do believe is the case, though, is that there are lots of technocratic issues that are very in the weeds, either at a regulatory agency or in a multi-thousand-page legislative bill. There could be one or two provisions that are really, really important, or that are very poorly written and could be improved a lot, or something that's not there and could be, included with the right advocacy campaign. Elite-driven theory of change, where on these issues that are really important, but it's not even the public opposes them or supports them, they're just totally unaware these things are happening. We want to make sure that policymakers are adopting pro-innovation policies that actually improve overall social welfare, and we want to support champions who already agree with us but just don't have the resources to do proper legislative drafting or engage in the full rulemaking process. We want to support them throughout that entire pipeline. And so, yeah, in terms of public opinion, I'm mostly concerned with influencing the conversation within DC to make sure that the right issues are prioritized.
I just say that I think in some ways public opinion does affect policy outcomes as well, though, right? So like,
totally.
for instance, which is something you've pushed, I think I could very easily see it becoming like Anthony Fauci wants us to like, I wants to blast us with lasers or something. And then maybe you don't get as widespread adoption. I guess that's something we saw with vaccines as well. So yeah, I guess not to say that the work you're doing isn't important. I just see it as kind of, maybe a second step down the road. Once you unlock the right policy, the next barrier is implemented in the right way, in a way that has popular support and buy-in.
Yeah.
On the topic of FAR UVC, it seems like there's also, I guess, a kind of a broad push towards technology in the biosecurity space, things like monitoring, like defensive technology. And I think like wastewater surveillance is one that sticks out to me as particularly promising. I wonder if you've seen, I guess, any like optimism towards this technology recently, and how feasible you think implementation of these kinds of ambitious but big if true projects could be.
Yeah, I think there are lots of great folks laying the groundwork for these things. I'd highly recommend folks look into Blueprint Biosecurity. They're doing great work. They have a huge research stream right now on FAR UVC, and they're trying to map the entire almost tech tree of what are all the inputs that go into building FAR UVC systems and potential regulatory barriers, who are all the stakeholders. They're really mapping the entire space. And I think once that report is public, we'll all have a better sense of what the feasibility is, what are the bottlenecks that we need to unlock. And then on wastewater surveillance, that one's a tough one because it's mostly around I think part of what the issue there would take up is a federalism issue, where you have all these cities that manage their own water supplies. And so if you're a company, you have to sell to each one of them. The COVID subsidies and funding streams have been inconsistent, to say the least, and so you can't just count on like the CDC subsidizing this stuff. And then there are different ways to partner. A good pilot program that the CDC is running in airports to do some kind of testing and sampling there, but absolutely should be widespread. And so I would say there's promising movement here, and yeah, the main thing people need to avoid is being very careful in their messaging of how they talk about FAR UVC, how they talk about obviously it could be called surveillance testing, avoiding words like that when you're talking to a mass audience, because at the end of the day, it's for testing, it's anonymous. It's really about, we want to know what's circulating in the environment to protect everyone. No one's privacy is being harmed, and everything we know thus far about FAR UVC is that it's safe for human skin, does not penetrate the skin, is safe for long exposure. But we can obviously do more safety testing there as well to keep reassuring people.
Yeah, I agree. I guess beyond those technologies, is there anything you're really excited about in the biosecurity space?
I think FAR UVC is still top of the list.
It doesn't have to be technology as well. Could be development.
I just want to say a little riff on FAR UVC. The reason I'm most optimistic about FAR UVC because it doesn't require individual adoption. So what we saw during the pandemic was an issue is that there are certain interventions like masking And to some extent, the vaccines, especially after the initial efficacy numbers were very strong, and then there were variants and those waned. And so if you're relying on herd immunity or you're relying on universal masking, that's a very high bar to meet for public health interventions. And so I'm more bullish just from a practicality perspective on interventions that require only a few sophisticated actors to adopt and deploy. And so people who own buildings, who own infrastructure, who are in charge of maintenance and operation, if they were the ones to make the decision to invest and deploy FAR UVC in all major public places, that would make everyone safe by default and wouldn't require uptake by 330 million Americans. It would be kind of done on our behalf, and it would ideally cut transmission before it even becomes a pandemic, so to really control outbreaks. And so that's why I'm really excited about it. Other things, more prosaic. We still haven't yet cracked the code on a really comfortable but protective mask. And so elastomeric masks, I think, are the best ones we have on the market now, but hospital workers don't like to wear them. They don't think they're as comfortable. And this seems like a hard problem, but not an impossible problem. I think it's based on the physics, like we could have a 99.9% effective mask that is comfortable to wear, but it probably costs more, and it takes real innovation to figure out how to crack that.
Yeah, I think the kind of individual versus system level is a good point. And I think another cool intervention which doesn't rely on the individual level is monitoring on farms for zoonotic pandemics. Like this is something that's also been in the news recently. Any thoughts on agriculture and how that plays a role in biosecurity?
Yeah, for sure. I'm 100% supportive of more testing to prevent zoonotic spillovers. Seems like the agricultural industry is not being super cooperative there, which is disappointing. But I think, yeah, the earlier we catch these things before they become pandemics, the the better it is. And so, yeah, I don't know if I would say that beyond like, yes, we should be testing all these animals, and it feels insane that we're not.
Sweet. All right. I want to ask a little now about technology more broadly and relationships between the federal government and private companies. So you wrote recently a piece, I think, praising SpaceX for what they've been able to do in terms of space launches and how that expands capacity for the US government. Elon Musk has also been in the news recently for conflict with Brazil over like Twitter moderation policy. And like he kept X running on Starlink while it wasn't accessible on Brazilian internet. So in this context, I'm curious about how you think about, I guess, interest alignment between private companies that increasingly do a lot of the things that federal governments used to do. So in the space sector, it's SpaceX. In defense, like Palantir and Anduril, as like small, like tech-driven startups. I think building capacity for the federal government in a place where the government like has really struggled in the past, but also, creating some reliance where if Anduril went out of business or Palantir went out of business, it might create some serious harms for the Department of Defense. And I guess maybe the real risk here isn't that they go out of business, but that, I don't know, Palmer Luckey goes rogue and decides he wants something different from Lloyd Austin. So I guess the question here is, how do you think about that risk that increasing privatization might present? And does that, I guess, at all moderate your opinion on SpaceX?
Yeah, so I think definitely the government should be encouraging diversification within the military procurement system. And so this weird system where I think they do have rules around sole source contracts where they really try to limit it and fund competitor companies. But also, when I've read this history before, there's these amazing charts that show consolidation in the defense procurement industry. And we have like the big five now, like the Northrop Grummans of the world, Boeings, etc. And there has been massive consolidation, which was encouraged by the federal government. The federal government said it is too hard to work with, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of large suppliers. So it'd be better if there were a few of them, and they encouraged them to merge. And so now we're in a case of consolidation from the legacy side, and there are some new players like Anduril and SpaceX that, through just sheer competence, have created somewhat of a dependency. And so I would definitely be supportive of the federal government making sure that in a case where there is exclusive reliance on one vendor that they are subsidizing and giving contracts to competitors to make sure that we have alternative options. But also at the end of the day, sometimes due to economies of scale, due to network effects, there are just natural monopolies. And I'm very happy that those companies are built in the United States versus being built in foreign countries. And we have other tools for making sure that they aren't selling weapons to foreign adversaries, and that they like at the end of the day, there could be scenarios where Palmer Luckey or Elon Musk, come in conflict with the United States government, but we are a sovereign country and they are private companies, and they are not the U.S. military, so I'm not super concerned.
Sure. Yeah, that seems like a valid take. All right, I have exhausted my policy-related questions, so now I have a couple fun ones to close.
Cool.
So the first one is, so most of your work is focused on, I guess, the policy impacts of science. So like normatively, like how can we encourage good science? Like how can we encourage good utilization of science? I think there's something wonderful about maybe like getting your head out of the weeds and then just thinking about these discoveries in and of themselves as like, a little kid in the candy store looking around at all these wonderful inventions that are happening. So I wonder if there's a specific scientific development that really fascinates you just for the science, not for what it does for people or the world.
Yeah, just for the science, like I would say the protein folding model that Google came up with, the Google DeepMind team, because as far as I know, it's like this is what they ended up getting the Nobel Prize for, and it has great potential. But as of right now, I talked to my friends who are much more expert in biology than I am. They say that we don't yet know how to apply it. There are still future bottlenecks, and so as of right now, I'm pretty sure it's just a scientific finding that is very interesting. And it is just cool to see, like, when I've read summaries of the work, it's that humans have been hacking away manually and getting very small percentages of the protein folding algorithms defined. And then AI came through, which is like, here's the entire list. We've completely done it. And so it's just cool to see kind of a complete solution. There's just like this satisfying thing of now we know how to fold any arbitrary protein. But I'm probably using it. So like I was impressed by the paper.
No, I think that's really cool as well. And I will say the Nobel was really interesting this year. Like I guess Geoffrey Hinton was also, I think, a pretty cool awardee. Yeah, so
They're basically all AI Nobels. I think they probably gave even Daron Acemoglu for economics. I mean, it's about institutions and his work with his co-authors, but he's been in the news this year almost exclusively for AI. And so I think like almost like so many of the Nobel Prizes had an AI twist to them. Yeah.
he, I think, recently co-published with Toby Ord, which was very
There you
surprising
go.
for me. So
Yeah.
yeah, the next fun question is about media. So I think in the wake of Oppenheimer, a lot of people in the EA and progress studies movements were talking about kind of the role of media as a spark for discourse, like whether you wanted to be Oppenheimer or Fermi or Einstein, like who you would be in this movie. So I'm curious if there's any media that for you captures well the way you think about progress or science.
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind that I've seen multiple times and love is The Martian. And I think I just love, I think it really captures the human spirit and the idea of frontiers and exploration. And so he's on Mars. I'm sure everyone's obviously seen The Martian, but he's on Mars. He's trapped by himself, and there's like he's a choice, right? It's give up and die, or use your brain and what we know about science and engineering to survive. And the idea, and then there's like this like collective humanity of the movie. I love that like it becomes a mission of all of Earth to support bringing him home. People in the other ship, spaceship, turn around to go back and get him. There's like this like we are in this collectively as humans. We should care about each other, and when we're in tough new environments, we should use our tools to survive and flourish. And so I think it's a great story.
Yeah, I'm a sucker for both space science fiction and Matt Damon, so that was a good
There
movie.
you go. He's great.
Yeah, the last one to cap it off is just in the Pathways to Progress Fellowship, we are not exclusively, but mostly young people, many people in college or early career. Any advice you'd offer to people at our stage who are looking to build a career in progress studies and specifically looking to kind of fuse science and policy and make an impact in the world?
I would say move to DC and go work in policy. So there is a website that probably you guys are familiar with. That will I'm gonna find it right now, but um, there are ways to get into policy. There's a website called emergingtechpolicy.org that collects all of the pathways into DC for young people. So every single remotely related tech policy fellowship program is listed there, how to apply, what they're looking for, who's been through them before, how tech policy works in DC. So emergingtechpolicy.org, if you want to work in policy, that's by far the best one-stop shop. And then I would say, come do it. Like, I know a lot of young people who think they need to go to grad school first. Try policy first and then see how far you get. Maybe you can go get a master's or a PhD. I think it's obviously an appeal of academia, but things are moving so quickly and we have so many important issues to work on. I don't recommend many people go into academia. And then if you have the right skill set, I would say go be like a hard tech founder and go build something really cool. But a lot of young people are not super well suited for that yet. Like that takes more of like you need a decade or two of experience. So either go get that experience and build a really cool company. But an awesome thing about DC is you can contribute immediately. So if you're smart and ambitious and hardworking, you can move to DC, start getting internships, start getting fellowships. And within, if you're really hardworking, in 2 to 3 years, in a narrow policy subdomain, you can become expert and add value and start contributing. And that's so rare. It's not going to happen in academia. It's not going to happen in tech, hard tech at least. And so I think lots of people should come work in DC.
Yeah, that really resonates. I think the off-cited and I think maybe now out of date fact that the Biological Weapons Convention once had a budget less than that of the average McDonald's
Exactly.
is a good example of how, selecting for neglected policy areas means that you get to do a lot of really cool work from the jump.
Totally.
Yeah. All right. I think that's all I have for you today. We can end 2 minutes early. And yeah, thank you so much, Alec. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me, guys. This was fun.